Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever stopped to wonder how we actually measure human communication? I mean, it is infinitely more complicated than just filling in little bubbles on a multiple choice test. Today, we're going to demystify the completely fascinating journey of how language testing evolved. We're talking about the shift from rigid, strict grammar rules to measuring how we actually speak and interact in the messy, real world.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this scenario. You spent years, literally years, studying a language. You can absolutely crush every single written grammar test placed in front of you. But then, you travel abroad, you walk into a local cafe, and you just completely freeze when you try to order a simple cup of coffee. This right here highlights a massive historical problem in linguistics. Does knowing the theoretical rules of a language actually mean you have the ability to use it?
For a really long time, traditional language testing had this fundamental conflict. Early tests absolutely loved what we call discrete point testing. Think of your classic multiple-choice grammar questions. And why do they love them? Well, because they were super easy to score and they offered really high psychometric reliability. Basically, the statistics looked great on paper, but they completely failed to capture whether a test taker could survive an actual, messy, real-world conversation. Just memorizing structural rules simply wasn't translating to functional communication.
To understand how we tried to solve this problem, here is our roadmap for today. First, the early divide between knowing and using a language. Second, the shift toward communicative competence. Third, Bachman's detailed model of language ability. Fourth, modern communicative language testing, or CLT. And finally, the real challenges test developers face today.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Knowing versus Using Language, the early linguistic divide.
In the early days, pioneers of the field like Ferdinand de Saussure and Noam Chomsky separated language into two very distinct camps. On one hand, we have what Saussure called lang, and what Chomsky later called competence. Think of this as the internalized, idealized system of grammar rules in your head. It's pure, it's abstract, it's perfect. On the other hand, we have parole and performance. This is the actual, observed, everyday use of language by real people. Chomsky argued that linguistics should really only focus on those idealized rules, basically ignoring the infinite, messy, unpredictable ways that humans actually communicate out in the real world.
But of course, you can't ignore the real world forever, right? That brings us to Section 2, the communicative competence shift, moving beyond just grammar.
Let's move to and see how this shift builds across the decades. In the 1960s, Chomsky's strict idea of linguistic competence ruled the roost. But by the 1970s, sociolinguists started to rebel against this rigid structuralism. Delheims introduced this idea of communicative competence, arguing that social context matters just as much as grammar. Then, by the 1980s, researchers like Canale and Swain expanded this into a four-area model, which eventually paved the way for Lyle Bachman's highly comprehensive model in the 1990s.
Now, Delheims was a true game-changer here. He suggested that communication absolutely cannot be studied in isolation from its social context. It's just not possible. He proposed four essential parameters to judge someone's competence. Number one, is it formally possible? Meaning, is it grammatically correct? Number two, is it feasible? Like, can human memory and our cognitive structures actually process the sentence? Number three, is it appropriate in relation to the specific social context you're in? And number four, is it actually done? Meaning, does this language form actually occur out there in the real world? Himes basically proved that knowing the grammar is totally useless if you don't intuitively grasp the social and cultural rules of a conversation.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how Canale and Swain took Himes's ideas and built a highly influential model in the 1980s. They broke communicative competence down into four distinct components. You have your grammatical competence, for sure, the basic vocabulary and syntax. But they added sociolinguistic competence, which is knowing those sociocultural rules. They added discourse competence, which is the ability to connect sentences into a meaningful, cohesive whole. And crucially, they added strategic competence, which involves all the little strategies we use to compensate when our language breaks down or we forget a word.
But as comprehensive as Canale and Swain's model was, researchers still felt like a piece of the puzzle was missing. The picture wasn't quite complete. That leads us right into Section 3, Bachman's comprehensive model, mapping the complexity of language use.
Fast forward to 1990, and Lyle Bachman provides this incredibly precise map of language competence. He split the whole thing into two main branches. First, we have organizational competence. This includes the grammatical and textual rules needed to actually form and connect sentences. Then we have pragmatic competence. This is all about the relationship between the language user and the context. It includes illocutionary competence, which is really just a fancy academic way of saying you know how to use language to manipulate, teach, or interact with someone. And sociolinguistic competence, like having a sensitivity to different dialects and cultural figures of speech. It is a brilliantly detailed look at absolutely everything happening in our brains during a casual chat.
A massive part of Bachman's model is his redefinition of strategic competence. He described it as the mental capacity to relate language to the context. It actually involves 3 physical and psychological steps. First is assessment, which is identifying the information you need to achieve your goal. Second is planning, which is retrieving the right items from your language competence to formulate a plan. And third is execution, which is physically implementing that plan through neurological processes. It's literally a map of how our brains scramble and strategize to overcome a lack of vocabulary in real time. It's amazing.
Okay, so we have all these incredibly comprehensive, dense, academic theories. But how on earth do we actually apply them in the real world? This brings us to Section 4, Communicative Language Testing, or CLT, putting theory to the test.
So, the crucial point is this. Communicative language testing shifts the entire paradigm. Instead of assessing isolated language knowledge, like asking you to identify a dangling modifier on a multiple-choice sheet, CLT seeks to evaluate what test takers can actually do with the language to accomplish a purpose in an authentic context. It's all about action and real-world application.
To achieve this, test developers generally rely on 3 main approaches. The theory-based approach measures underlying traits using models like Bachman's. So for example, testing someone's strategic competence by having them rate appropriate responses to a hotel complaint. Then there's the real-life approach, which is authentic but atheoretical. Think of having a prospective student listen to a university lecture and immediately write an essay, directly simulating actual campus life. But the integrated approach is where the real magic happens. It borrows the best parts of the first 2. A great example is a test for an administrative assistant where they have to write an email announcing department news. It perfectly replicates their authentic daily work duties while deliberately pulling out the specific theoretical English competencies required for the job.
But as you might guess, capturing fluid human interaction on a standardized exam is far from easy. Let's move to Section 5, the challenges of CLT. The difficulty of measuring the real world. Test developers face some incredible hurdles here. First, there's construct operationalization, which really just means the incredibly painful task of turning these massive theoretical models into practical step-by-step test instructions. Researchers like Linda Taylor found this out firsthand when trying to implement Bachman's model into the IELTS exam. It's tough. Second, when you use human raters for speaking or writing, they naturally vary on which components of competence they subconsciously think are most important. And third, the real world doesn't stand still. Communication changes constantly with time and technology, meaning these tests have to constantly be updated to remain authentic. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate irony of our field, captured perfectly by researcher Luke Harding in 2014. He noted, quote, "Increasingly complex frameworks of communicative language ability may hinder as much as enable good test design," end quote. Making our theoretical frameworks more complex and more accurate to human psychology might actually make our tests harder to build and use. Sometimes too much complexity literally becomes a roadblock to practical application. So, this leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. As real-world communication rapidly shifts, just think about how technology, texting, and new generations have changed how we speak in just the last 10 years alone. How must communicative language testing evolve to keep up? It is an ongoing challenge for sure, and a brilliant intersection of linguistics, sociology, and education. Thank you so much for joining me and learning with me today on this explainer. Until next time, stay curious.